Doctor Who, The Eight Doctors, by Terence Diggs. Prologue. The Doctor closed the time machine with a sigh. Dear old HG, he muttered. Such an optimist, such an enthusiast, especially for the ladies. The Doctor smiled briefly, as if at some pleasant memory. But then he frowned, as the recent, subjectively recent events of the Millennium celebration in San Francisco flashed through his mind in a jumble of outrageous images. It had been a weird, fantastic adventure, full of improbable, illogical events. He scowled at the memory of the Master, treating his precious TARDIS as if it were his own. How bad had he got in the first place? Where had he acquired those mysterious morphic powers that he had made use of so freely? Useless to speculate, decided the Doctor. He would probably never know the answers now. He looked around the vastness of the reconfigured TARDIS console room. With its redwood-panelled walls and complicated console, he had been so pleased with it once, now it seemed to carry the lingering tint of the Master's presence. The Doctor stood up abruptly, suddenly troubled. Better make one final check, just to make sure that none of the Master's malignant influence remained. Leaving the TARDIS console room, the Doctor made his way to the cloister room. He paced slowly along the pillared walkways and crossed the stone-flagged square, entering the massive central structure that held the Eye of Harmony. He stood gazing down at the flat granite sculpture in the shape of a great closed eye. It wasn't the Eye of Harmony at all, of course. Not really. Just a symbolic manifestation, an aspect of the great Eye of Harmony on Gallifrey. Created by Omega, stabilized by Rassilon, the eye held a trapped black hole. Its inexhaustible energy powered the whole of Gallifrey, including all the TARDISes, with which the Time Lords voyaged through space and time. Even an antiquated Type 40, like this one, was directly linked to it. The Doctor studied the eye for a moment longer. It was closed, as it should be. Everything was in order, except in the stone corner of the closed eye, something gleamed like a tear. The Doctor leaned forward to study it more closely. It was solid, like a tiny gleaming diamond. Surely it must irritate the eye, thought the Doctor, like those gritty fragments children call sleep that they sometimes find in their eyes upon awakening. He leaned in closer still. The little diamond started to blaze even more brightly. It glowed and burned and spun itself into a bolt of pure energy that lashed out and upwards and flashed into the Doctor's eyes, searing across his brain. The Doctor staggered back, his hands to his eyes, and crashed to the ground. As he fell, he heard a mocking voice. Always one less trap, Doctor. All's ill that ends ill. The Doctor spiraled down into blackness with the Master's mocking laughter ringing in his ears. Some time later, he had no idea how long, the Doctor awoke. He got to his feet and stood swaying for a moment, rubbing his eyes. He looked down uncomprehendingly at the flat stone sculpture of a closed eye, relieved when its blurred outlines focused into a sudden clarity. At least he could still see, but what was he seeing? With a sudden shock of horror and fear, he realized that his surroundings were weird, exotic, and completely strange to him. He turned and staggered away, out of the cathedral-like building, across the stone-flagged square. He had a destination. He knew that, if nothing else. Something was drawing him. There was somewhere he needed to be. His stumbling footsteps took him along a different route through the labyrinth interior of the TARDIS, ending up in a room with white, rounded walls, and a many-sided central console. This, although he didn't realize it, was the old, traditional TARDIS control room. In all its classic simplicity, a few old-fashioned chairs, a comfortable lounge, an antique table, a hat stand, a tall column with a statue of a bird on top. There was something comforting, reassuringly familiar about this room. He leaned on the control console, hands spread out flat. The console seemed to tingle with warmth. Life and strength flooded into his body. He had found an old friend. After a moment, he straightened up and looked uncomprehendingly around him. What was this place? Clearly it was some kind of control room, but what was it supposed to control? He wandered about the room, There were chairs, a table, a teapot with an unwashed mug beside it. He touched the wall, and a locker door swung wide open, revealing a rack of clothes. A man stood beside the locker, watching him. A tall, blue-eyed man with longish hair. He wore a long velvet coat, a wing collar, and a cravat. They stared at each other for a moment. The doctor raised a defensive hand, and the figure did the same. Suddenly, he realized that he was looking at himself in a full-length mirror set to the locker door. He stared curiously into the face in the mirror. It was the face of a stranger. A word formed itself in his mind. Amnesia. He didn't know what he looked like. He didn't know who he was. He felt a girl's warm lips on his own and heard a voice shout exuberantly, "I am the Doctor!" The voice was his own. "Well, that's something," he murmured. A name, or at least a title, but it wasn't enough. Doctor of what? Which doctor? Doctor who? He heard another voice, but this time it wasn't his own. It was a deep, booming voice, rumbling and husky at the very same time. It called up a shadowy picture of a great vaulted chamber in which a shaft of light picked out a massive stone bier. On top of the bier lay a motionless form, dressed in ancient ceremonial robes. A frieze of Time Lord images ran around the sides of the bier, but the eyes in the stone faces were furiously alive. The voice said, "Trust the TARDIS, Doctor." Immediately, the Doctor knew that the TARDIS was where he was. The many-sided console beneath his hands, the infinity of rooms and corridors and chambers that lay beyond it. A mini-universe. And a sentient entity. An old friend. The voice in his head spoke again. "Trust the TARDIS. Let it take you back to the beginning." The Doctor's hands began fumbling over the controls. Chapter 1. Totter's Lane. A girl skidded around the corner into Totter's Lane and sped along the rutted pavement. A thin, weary girl with blue eyes and close-cropped fair hair, wearing black jeans, white t-shirt and trainers. Samantha Jones was on the run. Still running, she glanced over her shoulder and saw a little knot of panting figures turn the corner behind her. A hoarse voice shouted, "Sam, wait up! We only want to talk!" "Huh, sure you do." She increased her pace, lengthening the gap between her and her already flagging pursuers. She grinned. Smokers, boozers, barroom cowboys. The only exercise they got was pulling the ring pull on a can of lager. Sam Jones was a runner, 3 miles every morning without fail. She could leave this lot standing. She was nearing the other end of Totter's Lane when a tall, red-haired, skinny young man in black jeans, black t-shirt, and a black padded jacket stepped in front of her. "Hello there, Sam. Going somewhere?" Sam spun on her heel and ran back the other way. Baz was alone. But even alone, Baz was a lot more scary than any of those moronic thugs he called his gang. Unfortunately, she was now running back towards those same thugs. They had strung across the road to block her escape. 3 of them. Little Mikey, Pete, and Mo. Mo was short for monster. He was as big as a gorilla, but considerably nastier. Sam took a quick look over her shoulder and saw that Baz was strolling along behind her. Baz never ran. He would have considered it uncool. Sam glanced quickly around. She was running along the side of the high wooden fence. No turn-offs in sight. But there was a gate. Midway between her 2 sets of pursuers. She sprinted up to it. The gate was locked. But it wasn't all that high. She took a few paces back, sprang forward, and swung herself over the top. Sam Jones was a gymnast as well. As she dropped to the ground, she heard the first of her pursuers crash against the locked gate. She looked around her. She was in a junkyard. An abandoned junkyard, if such a thing was possible. There was an incredible collection of odds and ends. Broken furniture, old bikes and rusty lawnmowers, faded pictures and shattered frames, shop window dummies looking eerily human. A faded sign was propped against one wall. Totter's Lane Yard. I am Foreman. Prop. Of course, Sam thought. Foreman's Yard. The place had been closed for years now. a junkyard that had been junked. It had a sinister reputation that went back over 30 years. Something about a mysteriously appearing and disappearing police box. There didn't seem to be any sign of it now, but there had been tales of people just disappearing, and about strange silvery monsters. Aliens and UFOs? In Totter's Lane? Yeah, right. Sam heard the sound of heavy bodies footing against the locked gate once more. Little Mikey was saying, "Here, Mo, give us a bunk up." It was then that she heard a strange wheezing, groaning sound from somewhere behind her. The transparent column at the centre of the TARDIS console, somehow the Doctor knew it was called the time rotor, slowed in its rise and fall, and gradually came to a halt. The Doctor also knew that this meant that the TARDIS had landed. And what did you do when the TARDIS landed? Somehow he knew that too. You went outside and took a look around. Automatically the Doctor's hand went to the control that opened the TARDIS doors. Sam spun round, and there was the police box in the corner of the yard. Old, shabby, and out of date, it fitted in quite well. But it hadn't been there a moment ago. She saw the door begin to open. A young man appeared in the doorway. He wore old-fashioned, vaguely Edwardian clothes, and he had brown curly hair and extraordinarily bright blue eyes. He stepped out of the police box and closed the door behind him. He looked at Sam and smiled. "How do you do?" Sam gaped at him. From the other side of the door, he heard Baz's voice. "Smash it open, Mo!" "But Baz, smash it open!" A massive bulk smashed against the door. The lock gave way and the gates swung open. Mo staggered through, followed by little Mikey and Pete. Seconds later, Baz strolled through behind them, Mr. Cool himself. He shoved through the group and took his rightful place in front of them. The Doctor regarded the newcomers with mild interest. "How do you do?" he asks again. Nobody replied. Sam and Baz had eyes only for each other, and it wasn't because they were in love. "I want a word with you, Sam," said Baz. "We've got nothing to talk about." "There," the Doctor said helpfully. "The young lady doesn't want to talk to you, so now you can be on your way." Baz seemed to notice the Doctor for the first time. He glanced at him briefly, then turned back to Sam. "Who is this fancy-dressed loony?" "No idea." Baz gave the Doctor his hard man glare. "Well?" "I'm the Doctor." "Shut it, or you'll need a doctor." Ignoring the dutiful laughter of his little gang, Baz returned his attention to Sam. "I want to talk to you, Sam, about talking." Talks about talks. Very diplomatic. Baz spelled things out with deliberate enjoyment. "I want to talk to you about you talking about us." Sam looked quickly around, seeking some way of escape. There wasn't one. She tried to play for time. "Sorry, Baz, you've lost me. You've been talking to the filth about me," said Baz. "You've talked about Pig Foster, shortly after which we got turned over. Luckily, I haven't picked up the gear yet." "So they didn't find anything?" Baz took a plastic shopping bag filled with smaller plastic bags out of his pocket. "Now I've got to find a new drum. A new place for my stash. And it's all your fault, Sam." The sight of the drugs made Sam too angry to be cautious. "Now listen to me, Basil. Don't call me that." Sam ignored him. "We all know you're Coal Hill School's friendly neighbourhood dope dealer. Bit of pot, E for the ravers, a few tablets of LSD. I don't like it. But that's how it is these days." She pointed to the bag in Baz's hand. "But that stuff?" "Gotta expand, Sam. This is an enterprise culture, right? Crack is the coming thing." "Not at Coal Hill. Not if I have anything to do with it." "That's just it, Sam," Baz said patiently. "You haven't. Shut up and mind your own business. If you want to stay healthy, that is." Sam was too angry to be afraid. "What are you going to do if I don't? Duff me up? Kill me? There's witnesses, remember?" Baz glanced contemptuously at the Doctor. "Think I'd worry about him? He'll shut up. Or I'll shut him up." He gave her a would-be winning smile. Anyway, you got me all wrong." "I don't want to hurt you, Sam. I like you. I really do." Sam shuddered. The awful thing was, it was actually true. Baz did seem to like her, despite the fact that she'd always stood up to him. Because of it, perhaps. So I thought of a better idea, Baz went on. And what's that? He tapped open a plastic bag. Gonna give you a few free samples. What? Works very quick, this stuff, Sam. Right away you'll be feeling really high. And pretty soon you're really hooked. See, once you've tried it, you won't be so snooty about it. And you won't want to stop me no more. 'Cause I'll be your source of supply. You might even start being nice to me. Don't worry about the dosh, Sam. I'll give you a special price. After all, we are mates. Baz beamed at her, pleased that Boyd had come up with a neat solution to a tricky problem. Suddenly Sam felt sick with fear. You won't get me taking that stuff. I don't smoke. I don't even drink Coke. I'm a vegetarian. Sorry, Sam, you got no choice. Not the first time, anyway. After that, you'll like it. Baz nodded to his fascinated gang. Grab her. This won't take long. Baz's boys moved forward. Sam shrunk back towards the doctor and the TARDIS. Excuse me, said the doctor. He'd been standing there all this time like someone trapped by a baffling conversation at a party. Unable to join, but far too polite to move away. What? Snarled Baz. Let me just see if I've got this straight, said the doctor. He pointed a finger at Baz. You and your associates are engaged in the sale of illicit drugs in a school? To children? That's right, Sam said before Baz could reply. Now he's about to move on from soft drugs to hard. That stuff in the bag is crack cocaine. The doctor turned to Baz, who shrank under the freezing glare of those bright blue eyes. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? The question was obviously perfectly sincere. Baz was stung by the contempt in the doctor's voice. Look, it's just business, right? Keep out of it or you'll get hurt. Remorselessly, the doctor continued his summing up. Do I also gather that you now intend to forcibly administer drugs to this young lady so that she is unwilling or unable to hamper your activities? That's right. What are you going to do about it? I must ask you to come with me to the local authorities. He glanced inquiringly at Sam. Coal Hill Police Station, she said quickly. The doctor nodded. To accompany me to Coal Hill School Police Station, surrender those drugs and make a full confession. There was such authority in his voice that, just for a moment, Baz actually found himself moving to obey. Suddenly getting hold of himself, he turned to the largest of his gang. Mo did all the gang's heavy work. Mo would smash this prat who dared talk to him. To him, Baz, like he was dirt. Like he was nothing. Sort him, Mo. Mo rushed up, reaching out for the doctor, who stepped forward, took hold of Mo's right wrist and made a complicated-looking circular movement. Mo performed a complete somersault and landed flat on his back, all the breath knocked out of him. For a brief moment, the doctor recalled flying through the air, picking himself up and facing a many-armed, glowing-eyed being in a huge, misty cavern. Concentrate, Doctor, said the creature sternly. Remember, centering, circularity, focus, and balance. Use them to turn your attacker's strengths against them. Handicapped as you are, you should be able to do better than this. And with time and practice, he had done better, recalled the doctor. Pleased that at least one fragment of memory had been restored to him. In fact, he had become extremely adept at Venusian Aikido. Few two-armed life forms could claim as much. As Pete, little Mikey, and Baz closed in for the attack, the doctor moved gracefully amongst them, pulling here, twisting there. Amidst the yells and rage of pain, 3 bodies flew through the air in a kind of involuntary ballet, all landing on Mo, who was just struggling to get up. The doctor turned to the astonished Sam. Shouldn't you be back in school? Sam glanced at her watch. It was 11 o'clock. I suppose I should, really. Off you go, then. I can deal with these 4. You certainly can. Thanks. She looked at him for a moment. He was a very good-looking man. Pity he was balmy. With a nod of farewell, Sam slipped through the open gate and disappeared. The doctor looked at the pile of bodies, which started disentangling itself into 4 badly shaken youths. No one seemed very anxious to return to the fray. In fact, Mo was edging away, making for the exit. Before he could speak, there came the sound of a car engine. He went over and looked through the open gate. Cops! He dashed straight out of the gate and started running. They all heard the wail of a police siren. Reacting to a familiar stimulus, Baz and his boys had scrambled to their feet, dodged through the cluttered junkyard, and vanished over the back fence with amazing speed. Still feeling bemused, the doctor watched them go. Ought he try to stop them? Perhaps it was none of his business. But then, what was his business? What was he doing here anyway? As he turned to go back to the TARDIS, his foot brushed against something. It was Baz's plastic bag. He stooped down and picked it up, just as a blue-clad figure ran into the yard. A few minutes earlier, Constable Bates, who was old and cynical, and Constable Sanders, who was new and keen, turned into Totter's Lane in their area car. Bates was letting Sanders do all the driving. The experience was good for the lad. He was just about to point out that it was tea break time when a young, eagle-eyed Sanders had to go and spot some local scrote running out of Foreman's yard. "Look!" Sanders switched on the siren and put his foot on the accelerator. Bates shrugged. "Just some kids messing about." "That gate was locked yesterday," snapped Sanders. "Must be a break-in, at the very least." All right, grumbled Bates. "It's not exactly the great train robbery, is it?" By the time the police car screeched to a halt outside the junkyard, the running figure had disappeared around the corner. Sanders jumped out of the police car and ran into the yard, followed by a more leisurely paced Bates. They found an oddly dressed, long-haired man standing in front of an obsolete police box, a plastic bag in his hand. Sanders desperately wanted to whip out a magnum and scream, "Freeze, scumbag!" But that wasn't how you did it over here. Dropping a hand to his baton, he said, "May I ask what you're doing on enclosed premises, sir?" The man looked baffled. "I'm not really sure. I just sort of arrived." Bates took in the strange costume, the vague, staring blue eyes. Another one released into the community too soon, he thought. More out than in these days. "What's in the bag, sir?" presided Sanders. "Is it yours?" Now, I want a word with you about that," the doctor said. "Apparently it's something called cocaine. Crack cocaine." He gave him a reproving glare. "Were you aware that this stuff was being peddled in your area? There was nothing like this when I used to live here." At the mere mention of crack cocaine, Sanders and Bates both drew their batons. Drugs often meant guns these days, even in London. "Just hand me the bag, please," said Bates. "Yes, of course." The man handed it over. Bates looked in the bag, then turned to Sanders and nodded. "And where did you get this bag, sir?" "From a young man. He brought it here." "They must have been using this yard for a drug deal," said Sanders. "That kid I spotted was the lookout. He warned them and they all cleared off." Bates looked at the oddly dressed stranger. "This one doesn't seem to be in any hurry." Sanders didn't want to miss the credit for catching a big-time dope dealer. "We'd better take him in." "I really haven't got time to go with you now," said the man calmly. "I'm rather busy. Why don't you just take the drugs with you and I'll try and pop in later?" "I'm afraid it's not that simple, sir," said Sanders. "What's your name?" "You can call me the doctor." "Full name, please, sir?" Another dormant memory revealed. Smith. Dr. John Smith. He gave him a worried look. "I really must be off." Sanders put a hand on the man's shoulder. "John Smith, I'm arresting you for being in possession of a controlled substance. You are not obligated to say anything, but if you fail to mention anything which you later rely on in your defense, that anything that you do say may be used against you." The doctor stared at him. "What does all this mean? I don't understand." "Let me put it in layman's terms, sir," says Bates helpfully. "Doctor, you're nicked." Sam Jones slipped into the empty playground. Break was over by now, and she headed for the school buildings. She might still be in time to sneak into her next lesson. Maths with old Payne. Or maybe she'd just cut it. Her attendance record was still pretty good. Much better than what most people at Coal Hill School had. She was about to go inside when a voice behind her said, "Oi!" Sam gasped and turned around, heart thumping. She was suddenly afraid that Baz had managed to get there before her and was waiting in ambush. But it wasn't Baz. It was a stocky, fair-haired young man, in jeans and a sports jacket. He might have been one of the other pupils, but he wasn't. He was Trev Shelby, one of the younger teachers. "What have you been up to, Samantha?" Trev did his best to look stern. which wasn't easy with a round, cheerful face and a snub nose. "Nothing," said Sam. "Had to pop out during break. To quote the school rules, pupils are required to remain upon the school premises during break times. Anything in the way of popping out is strictly forbidden." "I didn't have much choice." Trev Shelby looked at her. She was clearly shaken up. Much more so than was called for by being caught in a minor bit of rule breaking. She looked worried and frightened, and Samantha Jones was usually pretty cool. "What's up, Sam?" "Nothing." "Don't give me that." Sam looked round. "It's nothing, really." Trev sensed that she was uneasy in the open playground. "Come with me," he ordered. "Where?" "Staff room. It should be empty by now." But the staff room wasn't empty. Not quite. A tall young woman with black hair drawn back in a bun was sitting in the corner, marking a pile of essays. She peered over a pair of oversized glasses as Trev Shelby marched Sam inside. "What's going on?" "I've brought Samantha in for a cup of coffee and a chat. You know that's against the rules." "Tell me about it." He went to the urn in the corner and poured a lukewarm coffee for Sam and himself. "One for you, Vicky?" "Yes, I suppose so." Vicky Latimer looked at him in amused exasperation. Like Trev, she was one of the younger staff, but their temperaments were very different. Vicky was a believer in obeying rules and keeping up the standards. Hard work in present-day Coal Hill. Trev Shelby just wanted to get through the day. Or so he said. But he was a good teacher, almost in spite of himself, and he cared a lot more about the kids than he let on. "Sam's upset about something," he said. "Maybe you can get her to talk about it, Vicky? You know, girly talk." "Chauvinist oaf," said Vicky. "What's the matter, Sam? Anything you can tell us about?" "Someone giving you a hard time?" asked Trev. Sam looked from one to the other. She'd lose all her cred if anyone found out. You just didn't talk to teachers. Not about some things. But suddenly, it all seemed too much. She nodded. "Baz." Trev frowned. "Baz Bailey, the Pill King? What about him?" "He thinks I've been grassing him up." Vicky looked baffled. "Informing on him to the police," explained Trev. He turned to Sam. "Why don't you just tell him he's wrong?" "He'd never believe me." "Why not?" "Because he's quite right." "What do you mean?" "Baz is right," repeated Sam patiently. Chapter 2. Information Received. Detective Inspector Foster drew a deep breath. "Now then, sir, let's just go over all of that again, just to make sure I've got things straight." They were at Coal Hills Police Station, a small interview room. The bottom half of the room was painted dark blue. The top half was hideously clashing pink. Some Home Office psychologists had believed that the pink had a soothing effect on people. Foster just found it irritating. Then again, after 20 years in the CID, he found most things irritating, though he wasn't supposed to show it. A big, solid, hard-faced man, Foster was perpetually simmering with suppressed rage. A human volcano in a smart blue suit with a sober tie. At a smaller table in the corner sat Detective Constable Bollard, in charge of the tape recorder. The tape recorder irritated Foster too. It meant it was harder to add those artistic little improvements to a statement that made things run much more smoothly in court. Made you wonder whose side the law was supposed to be on. Detective Constable Bollard irritated Foster as well. He was too young, too thin, too well-dressed, and too well-educated. But what was irritating Foster most of all at the moment was the prisoner, with his long hair and outlandish clothes. Nothing very unusual about that these days. But there was something strange about this particular prisoner. He sat on the other side of the scarred wooden table, looking vague and abstracted, as if his mind was far away. He'd answered all of Foster's questions politely and helpfully, but the story that his answers added up to... "Let's begin with the matter of your identity," said Foster. "I've already told you. You can call me the doctor." "What kind of doctor?" interrupted Bollard. "What do you claim to be qualified in?" "Practically everything." "Your name," said Foster. "We need a name for the records." "I told you that too. Smith." "First name John," said Bollard. "That's right. How did you know?" "Just a lucky guess. Dr. John Smith?" "Yes, that's right. You've got it." "How about giving us your real name?" "Oh no, I could never do that," the doctor said, shocked. Why not? It's secret, confidential. That's why they used to call me Fetus Sigma at the academy. But that was more of a nickname, really. I always use Smith when I'm on Earth. Very well, said Foster through gritted teeth. We'll stick with Smith for the moment. He drew a deep, calming breath. Now, you were found on enclosed premises at 76 Totter's Lane, in close proximity to an obsolete police box which you insist is your personal property. Indeed it is. Where did you get it? I'm not sure, but I've had it for a very long time. What's it doing in Foreman's yard? Demanded Bullard. Did you take it there? Oh no, quite the reverse actually, he says, beaming at Bullard, pleased with his little joke. Never mind the bloody police box, roared Foster. I don't give a monkey's brass... He broke off short, gulped, and drew another deep breath and said mildly, Let's leave the police box aside for the moment, sir. What about this? He gestured to Bullard, who handed him a plastic bag. For the benefit of the tape, I'm holding up a plastic bag containing a considerable quantity of a substance I believe to be crack cocaine. Is this your property as well, Doctor? Certainly not. It was found in your possession. It was found in my hand, corrected the doctor. That doesn't mean I own it. Foster looked at his notes. According to your story, the bag was formerly in possession of a youth who, in company with several others, was intimidating a young girl. You intervened, there was some kind of altercation, the police arrived, and the youths and the girl fled. The bag got dropped in all the first... And you picked it up, just as my officers arrived? That's it exactly, said the doctor. Well done. Well, if that's all... He stood up before being shouted, Sit down! Bellowed Foster, slamming his hand on the table so hard that the tin-lid ashtray bounced up in the air. The doctor sat. You want to watch those sudden adrenaline surges, Inspector. Not good for you, you know. In a strained, mild voice, Foster went on, If you could just spare us a little more of your valuable time, Doctor. Oh, I've got plenty of time, said the doctor. I am a Time Lord, you know. How did I know that? He asked himself softly. But it's true. The youth with the drugs, said Ballard. You say his name was Baz? That's what the others called him. Was he previously known to you? Never seen him in my life. And you say that Baz dropped the bag during your altercation? I suppose I must have done. I picked it up immediately afterwards. Foster brandished the plastic bag. This bag contains drugs worth several £1,000s. Is it likely that he'd simply leave it behind? It was quite a vigorous altercation, the doctor mumbled. This Baz you describe is already known to us as a local drug dealer, said Bullard. Pills and pot, strictly small time. We got an anonymous tip-off that he was moving into hard drugs. The doctor nodded. From the girl, presumably. That's why he was so angry with her. He looked from Bullard to Foster, his bright blue eyes sparkling with interest and intelligence. Surely what you've just told me confirms my story. The man might be a raving mad space cadet, thought Foster, but he certainly wasn't stupid. Perhaps it does, said Bullard, or perhaps it's all part of a very different story. We know Baz was moving into hard drugs. What we don't know is who was supplying him. The doctor looked horrified. Surely you don't think... Why not? Said Bullard. Even the name fits. Lots of dodgy doctors in the drug business. Oh, come on, I'm not a dodgy doctor. Foster gave the doctor his most intimidating stare. I put it to you, Doctor. You were Baz's supplier. You came down to Foreman's yard to make a deal. My officers turned up. The others, who knew the neighbourhood, escaped. And you were left holding the bag. It's a very nice theory, the doctor said admirably. It fits most of the facts, and I can see why you would find it so attractive. So much nicer for you to have captured a big-time drug dealer. Well, Doctor, asked Foster, isn't that what happened? Good grief, no! As I said, it's a very nice theory. But unfortunately it's utter balderdash. The doctor considered for a moment. Tell you what you do. Talk to the other two policemen and see if their recollection of the arrest fits your story or mine. Then find the girl, Sam, the others called her. See if she confirms my account of what happened. Pick up this Baz and see what he has to say. I'm in charge of this case, Doctor, not you, snarled Foster. He leaned forwards menacingly. Now, Let's go through this story of yours again. In the staff room at Coal Hill School, they'd been discussing Sam's predicament for some time, but they were still no nearer to finding a solution. What I can't understand is why you had to get involved, said Trev Shelby. If you'd minded your own business, it was her business, said Vicky. It's everyone's business. How could she keep quiet if she knew drug dealing was going on? Look, everyone knows about Baz. You know the most helpful advice you can give kids about drugs? Find a good dealer, one who doesn't sell dodgy gear or rip you off, and stick to him. Oh, that's terrible, Trev. And you know you don't mean it. No, he's right in a way, said Sam miserably. I did know all about Baz's pot and pills. I turned a blind eye, like everyone else. So what changed your mind? Asked Trev. You know Marilyn Sims in Year 5? The one with the outstanding personality, said Trev. Who doesn't? Trev, said Vicky warningly. Sam arched an eyebrow. Marilyn was well developed for her age. For any age, really. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and tried her very best to emulate her film star namesake. Marilyn's a dedicated weekend raver, said Sam. She told me that Baz had been dropping heavy hints that some really grown-up gear would have been available soon. Marilyn wasn't interested. Even she's not that dim. But plenty were. What do you reckon he was talking about? Asked Trev. Cocaine? Heroin? He had some stuff with him, said Sam. In a plastic bag. She shuddered. He was gonna make me take some. Right away you're really high, and pretty soon you're really hooked. That's what he said. What did it look like? Like pebbles? Little rocks? Crack, said Trev grimly. I take it all back, Sam. You were right to call the cops. That stuff's evil. What is it? Asked Vicky. A form of cocaine. Comes in little pieces called rocks that you can smoke. Gives an incredible high. Just for a few seconds. Then you crash and start craving more. One single rock is cheap enough. Some dealers even give the first one away. It's a good way to make new customers, especially young ones. Vicky said, We've got to do something. I know what I'm going to do, said Sam. I'm going back to Foreman's yard. That strange man helped me and I just left him. Perhaps he's still there. Perhaps Baz is still there, said Trev. I'd better come too. Tell you what, said Vicky. We'll all go. But not now. Trev and I have classes to take, Samantha, and you've got your next lesson to go to. We'll meet up at the dinner break and all go together. Baz was holding a council of war in what he liked to think of as a gangland HQ. It should have been a penthouse complete with a swimming pool. In fact, it was a wrecked, ruined, and illegally squatted derelict flat on Coal Hill's biggest and most run-down estate. He had other such flats in other nearby estates. When the police raided one, he would simply move to another. This flat was one of the best. It even had furniture, including a beat-up sofa, with gaping upholstery and projecting springs. Watched by his gang, Baz was stretched out onto it now, talking into his mobile phone. You're sure? The gear's still there? Okay, good, yeah. Don't worry, I'll see you, right? Baz stowed away the phone and sat up. According to my source, the stuff is still at Coal Hill Nick. Sitting on a table in the interview room. Baz's source was one of the station civilian clerks, a mild-looking little man with a serious tranquilizer habit. In return for free supplies, he kept Baz posted on police moves. He was the one who told Baz about Sam's tip-off, and he had warned him about the coming police raid. Little Mikey, Pete, and Mo looked at each other despairingly. So what do we do now? Asked Pete. Go and get it back, of course. It's our property, innit? Mo expressed everyone's thoughts when he said, We can't do that. We'll get nicked if we do. We'll get murdered if we don't, said Baz. You know where I got that gear? Machete Charlie's mob, up west. I convinced him there was a market down here. I persuaded him to let me have the stuff, on credit. I was to sell it on, keep a percentage. My percentage is worth 1,000. So you can imagine how much the gear itself is worth. Baz looks around his little gang. Charlie won't be pleased if he doesn't get his money. You remember why they call him Machete Charlie? I'd finish up in bits, scattered all over Coal Hill. This time it was little Mikey who expressed the gang's loyal thoughts. Yeah, well, I mean, that's tough, Baz. Really tough, but I mean, that's down to you, innit? Baz expected this reaction, and he had his answer ready. Oh, don't you believe it. Charlie's boys are very tough. They'd start with me, but they'd finish with you lot. Just to make an example of us. So what are we gonna do? Asked Pete again. Baz grinned. Don't worry, I've got a cunning plan. What do you think then, Gov? Asked DC Ballard. Foster took a swig of tea. About what? About our friend in there. I mean, we'll have to charge him eventually or let him go. Foster bolted at his last few chips and said instinctively, I'm aware of police regulations, thank you very much. They were in the station's tiny canteen, a little room filled with tin-top tables and rickety chairs, with a serving counter at one end. They'd broken off the interrogation, such as it was, for lunch. Egg, chips and beans, and strong tea. They weren't really getting anywhere. The doctor listened to all their accusations and theories with friendly interest, and had refused to change or add to his story in any way. Now he was sitting in the interview room, under the watchful eye of a constable, enjoying a nice cup of strong, sweet tea and a thick bacon sandwich. Foster didn't want any accusations of police brutality ruining his case. If he had a case. He's too cool, he muttered. Treats it all like a game. We've got him on possession, surely, Gov. Oh, I wouldn't swear to it. Suppose the court believes that daft story of his. You say there's no form? Ballard shook his head. Plenty of docs and doctors on the computer, but none of them matches the description. And there seems to be something weird about his fingerprints as well. Foster wasn't paying any attention. He was cocking his head, listening to a confused roar come from outside of the room. It had been going on for some time, and it was getting steadily louder. By now there were shouts, angry voices. Sounds like trouble, said Foster, jumping up and hurrying out, Ballard at his heels. When they emerged from the canteen, they found the reception filled with an angry mob. The crowd spilled out into the station steps, with people pushing and shoving to get inside. The air was filled with angry complaints about harassment, discrimination, police brutality. The desk sergeant, an older gentleman, close to retirement, was yelling, Ladies and gentlemen, please, if you'll tell me the problem, maybe I can help. But nobody took any notice. The shouting and shoving went on. Foster surveyed the crowd with a professional eye. Looks like every lowlife in the neighbourhood's turned out. Wonder what's got 'em stirred up this time. The little station had been besieged by an angry mob once before, when a local villain had inconsiderately collapsed and died inside of his cell. The fact that he'd actually died from a lethal mixture of drink and drugs, after first going berserk and wrecking the local pub, meant little to his friends and neighbours. When the news got out, they turned out in force to accuse the police of murder. Raising his voice above the din, Foster yelled to the harried desk sergeant, What's going on? Has there been some kind of incident? Not that I know of. They've all turned up at once and started shouting. In fact, the angry crowd was a renter mob, all part of Baz's cunning plan. He'd sent his boys out recruiting, each with a wad of £20 notes. To earn the money, all people had to do was turn up to Coal Hill Nick at lunchtime and complain about something, anything, as loudly and as angrily as possible. Anyone who managed to get arrested would get their fines paid and an extra 20 quid. They'd found plenty of takers. Baz and his boys were hovering at the back now, watching the mini-riot build up. Fights had broken out among the crowd, and the outnumbered police were desperately struggling to calm things down. Somebody threw a chair, smashing a glass partition. Right, in we go, said Baz. Try the interview room first, then Foster's office. If it's in the safe, we'll have to jump the desk sergeant and take his keys. They'd all been in and out of the local nicks since they were children, and they all knew the layout of the little station. Melting into the angry, shouting crowd, they shoved their way into the police station. In the interview room, the doctor finished the last sip of his tea and looked inquiringly at the nervous young constable. There seems to be some kind of trouble outside. The noise had been growing louder for some time. They could hear the angry yells and the sounds of breaking glass. Torn between his desire to help and Foster's orders not to take his eyes off the doctor, the constable hovered indecisively. Suddenly the door was flung open and a group of young men strode into the room. The constable jumped up and immediately went down under the combined onslaught of Mo and Pete. Ignoring the doctor, Baz's eyes scanned the room like radar. Before fastening onto the plastic bag on the corner of the table, next to the tape recorder. Lunging across the room, he grabbed the bag and headed for the door. He was almost there when a long arm reached out and a hand grabbed the back of his collar, yanking him back. The doctor had no use for the drugs, but he didn't want Baz to have them and sell them to the local kids either. Snatching the bag from Baz's hand, he threw the drug dealer casually across the room and made for the door. The doctor was intending to surrender himself and the drugs to the authorities, but instead he found himself faced with a shouting, seething mob. Suddenly, something struck him on the forehead, and a blinding flash seared across his brain. Little Mikey had been waiting by the door of his cosh. The doctor reeled, but to Mikey's amazement he didn't fall. He staggered out of the room, turned away from the crowd, and stumbled down the corridor. Back in the interview room, Baz got to his feet and hurled Mo and Pete off of the semi-conscious constable. "That weird bloke's got away with the gear," he screamed. "We've got to get after him!" Trapped by the crowd, Foster saw the doctor staggering off with a plastic bag, closely followed by Baz and the gang. "I was right," he yelled. "The doctor was in it all along. Baz and his gang set all of this up to rescue him, and now they've got away with their boss and the drugs as well." Foster and Bollard started fighting their way through the crowd. The doctor stumbled out into a little yard. The blow on the head had set him back, temporarily at least, to the moment that the master's trap had been sprung. Dazed and sick, he knew only that he didn't have long here, and that something was drawing him away. The yard gates stood open, and the doctor set off in a stumbling run. Baz and his boys spilled out into the yard. The doctor was nowhere to be seen. "He got away," said Mo, never one to avoid the obvious. "He won't get far," said little Mikey eagerly. "I caught him a good one with this cosh." Baz nodded. "We know where he'll be making for." He slid his hand inside his jacket. "This time I'm ready for him. Come on." It was some little time later that Foster and Bollard had both, battered and bruised, managed to stagger down the front of the steps of the station, just as Constable Bates and Constable Sanders were pulling up in the area car. Sanders, as usual, was at the wheel. He looked on in amazement at the howling mob inside the station. "What's going on, sir?" Foster jumped into the back of the police car, and Bollard got in the other side. "Just a bit of a riot," said Foster. "Should we go in and help, sir?" "No, ignore it. Get moving!" "Where to, sir?" Foster told him. "Well, there's the police box," said Sam, "but there's no sign of a man." Sam, Trev, and Vicky stood in a loose group around the old police box in Foreman's yard. Sam put her hand flat against the door. "The odd thing is, it feels alive." Trev looked around the deserted yard. "No point in hanging around here." "Maybe the poor man got arrested," suggested Vicky. "You said he was a bit strange. If the police found him here, they might have thought he was involved." "Then I'd better go tell them that he wasn't," said Sam. She turned away from the police box just as the doctor, still clutching the plastic bag, staggered into the yard. "There he is," Sam whispered. Ignoring them, the doctor made his way to the door of the police box and leaned against it for a moment. Somehow, the action seemed to give him strength. He fished a key from his pocket and opened the door. "Doctor," Sam said, "are you all right?" He turned and stared at her, the blue eyes wide and unseeing. There was a livid bruise across one side of his forehead. "You've been hurt," said Sam. "What happened?" "Sorry," said the doctor. "Must get away. Wrong time. Wrong place." "Oi, you!" screamed the voice from the gate. Baz stood in the doorway, with Pete, little Mikey, and Mo behind him. "Where do you think you're going with my gear, Doc?" Ignoring him, the doctor turned to Sam. "Goodbye." He stepped inside the police box, closing the door behind him. Baz rushed forward and hammered on the door. There was a strange wheezing, groaning sound, and suddenly he was hammering on nothingness. Slowly Baz turned around, stunned, as they all were, by the impossibility of what they'd just seen. But he still had a good grasp of his priorities. "I'm a dead man without that gear," he said conversationally. He slipped a hand inside his jacket and took something out. There was a click, and the long, thin blade of flick knife sprang from his fist. "Hey!" shouted Trevor in alarm. Baz was too far gone to even notice. "I brought this with me, for the doctor." "Well, he's gone now," said Sam. "You've missed your chance." "Ah, but you're still here," said Baz. "And you started all this, didn't you, Sam?" The blade of the knife gleamed as he advanced towards her.